Well, in a significant boost now to South Africa's infrastructural development, the Board of Directors of the New Development Bank has granted a substantial loan of 17.8 billion rand for water and sanitation projects. Announced during the NDB's 9th annual meeting in Cape Town, this funding will then be allocated under South Africa's Municipal Infrastructural Grant, aimed at reducing infrastructural backlogs as well as improving essential services for underserved communities. Well, to further unpack this, we are now joined by Lubabalo Luyaba, a water and sanitation specialist at SALGA. Lubabalo, thank you so much for joining us this evening. So in a nutshell, what does this actually translate to?
A very good evening to yourself, Alucia. Well, as you know, the Municipal Infrastructure Grant is targeted at providing basic infrastructure access to poor households. So what that practically translates to is an acceleration in the delivery of access to water and sanitation for poor households. And you'll know, Alucia, from the recent Statistics South Africa results, we have been slow to eradicate backlogs in poorer households, with at this point in time, only about 91% of households having access to water and about 82% having access to sanitation. So this will provide an injection that allows municipalities to accelerate the rate at which they provide these very critical and basic services to very needy households.
Interesting indeed. Now, Lubabalo, please elaborate on how the 17.8 billion rand will actually be distributed and allocated to the various municipalities, and what submissions or information will then be required of those municipalities, or it's generally all across the 9 provinces?
Firstly, I think we must commend our government for how it deals with public finances. I think we've got transparency and accountability. So specifically in the Municipal Infrastructure Grant, it's called a conditional infrastructure grant, meaning there's certain conditions that a municipality must satisfy before it is given funding to implement a project. So with this funding, those conditions will continue to be observed, and these conditions ensure that there's transparency, accountability, the projects that are implemented are appropriate, there's adequate planning that takes place, and at every stage of the project, there is oversight. So the money will ultimately go to municipalities that are already municipal infrastructure grant receiving and responsible for water and sanitation services, but under these very clear and strict conditions in terms of disbursements of what is indeed public money. And it will be across the country.
Absolutely. Lubabalo, and maybe just take us through, in terms of the conditional infrastructural grant, who will then be responsible for the overall disbursement of the funds to the third party? Say, of course, if the municipality secures a bid or a tender, it gives out a tender to various tenderpreneurs that will be, of course, vying for this tender to work on the water infrastructure in that particular province.
Well, Alucia, I'm not going to pretend that there haven't been challenges with our procurement system, specifically for infrastructure. But what I must say is that the National Treasury, working with COGTA, specifically on the Municipal Infrastructure Grant, have introduced reforms that aim to ensure that we actually get value for money. Because previously, we would have instances where a project that perhaps should be only 1 million sometimes costs 7 million. To curb that, what has been introduced or reintroduced is something called the Infrastructure Unit Cost Guideline, which gives you a benchmark that says if you are doing a 200 millimeter pipe and it is made out of steel and it is this long, we expect the pricing to be at this value. And there's agencies such as the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agent who do vetting and who do periodic inspections and check that the work that is going to be paid for by the municipality has indeed been done. So those controls have been put in place because you raise a valid concern where in the past we have had what you can call tenderpreneurship, where money disappears and projects are not implemented. But going forward, I think there's a lot of reform and there's been a lot of changes and checks and balances that the government has put in place, partly in response to what the Auditor General has raised as inefficiency and wastefulness in the implementation of infrastructure projects, not only by municipalities, but across government as a whole.
And we saw the implications to that, Lubabalo. I mean, talking of those reforms, I mean, still on this very point, we know that, of course, the China-Africa Forum, just on the sidelines of this, will be commencing on the 4th to the 6th of September. And interesting enough is that on the agenda is this very issue of several countries in the continent actually not being able to service their debts, with an estimated total debt of about $1.15 trillion US. So, in effect, will the move towards that much spoken about BRICS currency also assist specifically in keeping our debts manageable, and with the option to also generate even more revenue in being a signatory to the bank, who also enjoys certain privileges?
That is a very complex issue, Alusha, but let me try and simplify it. I think, one, our national treasury is very prudent in that they do not allow us to borrow recklessly. So there's obviously clear conditions, and there's been assessments that have been done to determine whether or not we can actually afford this loan. But two, Alusha, a very critical thing, and sometimes as end users, we remove ourselves from this situation. You've got to remember, at the end of the day, you and I use water, and it's either you pay for the water or it is subsidized. And what needs to happen is that that money needs to ultimately go to the municipality, then to the water board or the water trading entity, and so it goes. Currently, Alusha, we actually do have a serious problem. Municipalities are owed over 313 billion by households, by business, and by government. And in turn, if we just talk about water, we owe as a sector, municipalities to water boards and the water trading entity, about 40 billion. So in very simple terms, Alusha, if we don't deal with our non-payment culture and management of debt at the level of the end user, it's ultimately going to affect transactions such as these, because the money is just not going to come back in the system. And as you know, every loan must be paid back. So if the person who's using the product at the end isn't paying and there's wastage along the system, we will be in trouble. But again, this is on the radar, and there's a lot of work that is happening to deal with these types of challenges. But it's a very critical point you raise.
Absolutely, Lubabalo, because, I mean, if it's a loan, one then would understand that somehow, as you've just pointed out, it needs to be paid back. So hopefully, I suppose we will be getting some information and detail pertaining to how this is all going to, of course, unfold. But then also, on this other issue, Lubabalo, the challenges of the water mafia. I mean, how is, of course, SALGA dealing with this?
Well, I think it's a complex one. It manifests itself in different ways. And as SALGA, this has actually been escalated to the sector department that is responsible. We recently had a meeting with the new Minister of Water and Sanitation and the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, and it has been raised with the security cluster, because ultimately, as you'd understand, Alusha, it undermines everything that we're trying to do. We see it manifest in the implementation of projects, but also in certain instances, we see the advent of the rise of, let's call it, water tanker mafias that will sabotage municipal infrastructure so that water tankering is in effect. All of those issues, as SALGA, we have raised, and the security cluster is looking at measures of dealing with them. But the longer they continue, the more unsustainable the situation becomes, and the more wasteful we become ultimately as a country of a very scarce resource.
Lubabalo, thank you so much for your great input this evening, Mr. Lubabalo Luyaba, the Water and Sanitation Specialist at SALGA.